Welcome back. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the relationship between sadism and some of the contemporary movements that we see in both management and in society. But I want to take just a particular moment to discuss the metoo movement, things like the Black Lives Matter movement as well in this video. So in order to understand how this kind of bad behavior can occur, I think it's helpful to look at a doctrine that basically explains how this behavior occurs. And namely, that doctrine is sadism. Now, in order to understand the role of sadism in modern society, we're going to begin with a discussion very briefly of who was the Marquis de Sade. I'll tell you what exactly sadism is, and compare it to another doctrine that you may have heard of called sadomasochism. Then we'll talk about heterotopias. Heterotopias are separate spaces that are essential for the perpetuation of sadistic style behavior. And then we'll give a couple of applications, including a discussion of Black Lives Matter, metoo movement, and in general, abuse in the workplace. So, Marquis de Sade is the man who sadism is more or less named after. He was a French aristocrat who wrote a variety of novels that both at that time and in the contemporary world could be considered pornographic novels. They were also generally forbidden novels. Now, most people know about the novels, but they don't know much about the man. And, I'll never do full justice in this small video to his biography, but if you'd like me to do some more of those, more discussion about that, just give me some comments and I'll kind of whip up a playlist dedicated to that for you. But Marquis de Sade was a French aristocrat. He, by all accounts, had a very privileged life, although he wasn't a particularly rich aristocrat, and of course he had a problem with excesses. Okay? Namely, he excessed on gambling, he excessed in alcohol, he excessed in food, and he had a real problem. He liked prostitutes, which is not that unusual for that time that aristocratic people would like prostitutes. But what he did with those prostitutes is what got him into so much trouble with the law. He enjoyed sodomizing prostitutes, and he also enjoyed torturing them. One of his favorite activities was whipping the flesh off of prostitutes' backs and then pouring hot wax into the wound. He also enjoyed some other things that I'm not entirely sure is appropriate for kind of a general YouTube audience. But needless to say, he enjoyed terrorizing people. And the pornography and the actions that he did at that particular time are not particularly shocking, but what is shocking is the fact that he composed very elaborate justifications for his behavior. Furthermore, it's also interesting that he composed most of his doctrine while he was locked up in a variety of French prisons. Now, I'll spend just a little bit of it. It's kind of an interesting story that I think has been kind of swept under the rug of history. His most famous work is known as 120 Days of Sodom, 120 Journées de Sodome. And this book was written while he was imprisoned in the very famous Bastille in Paris. Now, a lot of people think that he was in the Bastille when they tore it down on July 14th, 1789. That is not actually true. He was in the Bastille just before it. The Bastille was actually a quite humane prison at the time. Most of the people were there were aristocrats. They had committed some sort of a crime, and the king deemed that they needed to be segregated from the rest of society. You could drink in the prison. You could have dinners. Some people brought their pets. Some people even had servants in the prison. Marquis de Sade had a very elaborate, fancy library in his cell, for example, with hundreds of books. And one of the things that he really enjoyed while he was in the Bastille is walking around on the turrets every day. Now, because there were disturbances in Paris around the Bastille at the time, the wardens of the prison indicated that prisoners should stay in their cells temporarily for their own safety. And of course, Marquis de Sade was mad. So he took apart his chamber pot and used the pipe on the bottom of a chamber pot to shout out the window, "Help, help, they're killing us in the prisons!" Well, they weren't killing anybody in the Bastille. But it aggravated the rioters to the point that they recommended transferring de Sade to the prison in Charenton, and about 10 days after his transfer, the Bastille was torn down. So if he'd actually just kind of kept his mouth shut, maybe the French Revolution wouldn't have happened. But if it did, he certainly would have at least been freed from the Bastille, at least temporarily. Again, there's a lot of this biography that I'm not going to cover, but the thing that you need to remember the most is that he was a writer of pornographic literature that kind of prided itself on torturing or abusing members of the lower classes. Now let's compare sadism to another doctrine that you may know as sadomasochism. There's some similarities and there's some differences. Well, first of all, there's the masochism piece, kind of an addition to de Sade's doctrine. And masochism normally is thought of in a more of a sexual context. Leopold von Sacher-Masoch wrote about it, and he actually wrote this book called Venus in Furs. And even in his real life, he had these rules like his mistress could whip him, but only if she wore fur coats while she was doing it. But the point of masochism, and it builds on something quite similar to sadism, is that within certain contexts, there are certain rules that can be followed, and these are kind of separate areas. So in other words, think of it like this. You can say, most people would say lying is a bad thing, right? But you could also say, well, but we were playing poker, it was a bluff, therefore it wasn't a lie. Because within the game of poker, it's not lying. Most people would say that they agree that killing is wrong. Killing other people is wrong. However, if you're playing a game like Grand Theft Auto, then you're killing, but they're not really people because it's kind of within those rules of that game. Even though you wouldn't hopefully do those things when you turn off your console. So that's a big part of masochism is a strictness on these kind of rules. Sadomasochism also has almost an exclusively sexual connotation. People are engaging in certain kinds of behaviors within certain times or within certain places. Sadism, on the other hand, does have a sexual component to it, but I don't really think this is the essence of sadism. Sadism, I think, in contrast to sadomasochism, prides itself on having a contempt for human dignity. It is a philosophy that is anti-humanist, anti-democratic, and misogynistic all at the same time. That's a huge piece of sadism. Furthermore, within sadism, there always needs to be some sort of a justification for the behavior. Now, de Sade, because he was an aristocrat, always said that his behavior was okay because the people he was torturing were underlings. They were peasants, they were poor people, they were not aristocrats like him, they were just prostitutes, therefore it's okay. So the pornography piece is actually not what we remember de Sade for. There was plenty of other more shocking stuff out there. It's the fact that there always has to be a justification that goes with it. And it's these justifications that go with sadistic behavior that we're going to talk about in the particular societal and managerial applications of sadism. Okay, so hopefully I have not lost you yet. Let's talk a little bit of a further refinement of sadism, and namely that is the necessity of a heterotopia. And sadism and sadomasochism share this similarity. A heterotopia is a concept that has been termed by Foucault, and we might call that a separate space, a space where something else can occur. Now, we normally think of heterotopias as something beneficial in an organization, right? Think of, for example, your boss has a great idea, and or he or she thinks it's a great idea, but you at the operator level, the tactical level of the organization, you get with your buddies next to the water cooler and say, I think the boss is kind of off, and let's kind of do it this way, and you kind of come up with a plan, and you kind of do it this better way, because it's more faithful to what the organization actually needs. Well, these discussions that occur in the water cooler and these networks where you're kind of jointly coming up with some sort of alternative way, that's very much a heterotopia within a contemporary organization. Okay? De Sade also needed heterotopias for his actions. In fact, by all accounts, when you would meet de Sade in normal circles, he was a very handsome man, he was a very charming man, very charismatic, very capable and very intelligent. In fact, he was evidently a brilliant hospital administrator during the French Revolution, did a great job for the hospitals of Paris. He was evidently a great speechwriter. He was a decent playwright, I suppose you could say. He wrote some plays that were not really all that pornographic, and evidently they were okay. Certainly not the greatest of the time. They're not all that memorable even, but they were okay. So he's a smart guy. But when you would take, and this applies both in his biography and also in his literature, in order for him to perpetuate certain acts of perversion, you need to take and conduct those behaviors within these other spaces. Okay? So for de Sade, you could beat up prostitutes as long as it was in a brothel, as long as it was in a secret apartment he rented in Paris, as long as it was in a prison, as long as it was, had these orgy parties, and that was okay as long as it was in his remote castle of Lacoste where the government was not looking. He needs these separate spaces so that, the all-seeing eye of God does not really see what he's doing. The heterotopia is key. Okay? Now, let's tie this in to some applications. Okay? Sadism, as I mentioned, is not just about sex. It's about power relationships. It's, in many ways, not all that sexual. And as de Sade got older, of course, he got impotent, and so he engaged in sadistic behavior of other kinds. Killing for sadistic pleasure was kind of exciting to him. He also binged on food. Evidently, he got so fat that there wasn't a tailor evidently around that could make a set of pants big enough so that he could fit his legs in. He was really kind of engorging himself because he could no longer enjoy sexual pleasures, right? So it's about the degradation of human dignity through a variety of means, including of sexual means. Okay? And furthermore, there's an implication that certain rules are germane for certain people and a different set of rules is germane for others. In other words, because Marquis de Sade was an aristocrat, he could behave in a certain way that did not necessarily have to match those of the people around him. Okay? So let's look at some applications. You think about your boss at work, right? And your boss kind of, we used to have an expression in the Army. We would say, do as I say, not as I do. In other words, people in managerial positions would often behave in ways that would be considered unacceptable for those beneath them. Okay? That's an example of sadism in action. The same rules do not apply to everyone. And we maybe have even all experienced a little bit of sadism. I mean, you think about when you're a child, you think mom and dad aren't looking, so maybe you steal your brother or your sister's candy, and then you get that self-satisfaction, that personal enjoyment of getting to eat candy that doesn't belong to you. The candy tastes sweeter when you're not supposed to be taking it. That's really the essence of sadism. Okay? Now, let's think about something like the metoo movement, right? You'll hear, of course, men and women alike, but you'll hear about these kind of allegations of sexual harassment in the workplace. And people will say, oh my goodness, but I've known that person for years, and they're not like that. The heterotopia from sadism is why they're not like that. In other words, people that perpetuate these kinds of actions that are the source or the root cause of the Me Too movement, it's totally possible they could be dedicated family people. They can give money to charity. They can be great all the time, except when they're at work and they feel that nobody's watching, then something else happens, right? And then they engage in these kinds of behavior. I also think the Black Lives Matter is another good example. Again, something happens to people when they are put in positions of authority or power in such a way that they can exploit others. To my knowledge, de Sade never wrote about racism. I'm not sure if it's because racism wasn't a big deal back then, or he never thought of it, or he thought about it but didn't write it, or maybe I just totally missed it. If I have, feel free to comment below. But again, where people get put into positions of authority, they can take something, a life, privileges, freedom, etc., from people that are perceived to be beneath them. Key concept or key manifestation of sadism in action. Internet trolls are another good example of sadism in action. People post hateful comments on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, etc. because they think that nobody's looking. They think that nobody knows, right? And there's a degree of pleasure that comes out of getting pain from others. Again, another key piece of sadism. It's not a matter of an isolated orgasm. It's a matter of orgasming by causing discomfort for others. So what we see is bosses behaving poorly, people exploiting members in a sexual nature in the workplace, people in positions of authority who may be very nice, actually, when they're not on the job, behaving in a way that hurts other members of society, or even what you see with internet trolls. It's the idea that nobody is watching, and therefore you can take something from someone else. But you need this heterotopia to do it so that nobody can see what you're up to. Now I've given you, basically I've condensed, I don't know, about 300 years, no, probably not 300, about 200 years of literature on sadism into about a 15-minute video. So if you have any questions, an opinion, or whatever, make sure you comment below. If you found this video helpful, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll be posting more videos soon. Thanks for watching.